These IDF widows have lost everything. As they grieve for their husbands, they're also scrambling to make ends meet. Please give generously at idfwidows.com for the heroic widows and orphans of the fallen soldiers of the IDF. That's idfwidows.com. Since the beginning of this war, one of the topics that we've talked about, that everyone's been talking about, and that we notice in the media and in the streets of our cities, is what we call the Red-Green Alliance. Red meaning the Marxists, green, the color representing the Islamists, the jihadists, the jihad supporters. And what we've seen is this strange blend of, again, these progressive left-wing Marxists who tend to be atheists and very progressive and liberal in their values, working hand in hand with Hamas supporters, with jihad supporters, essentially in support of Islamic fundamentalists. And we all point out that this feels a little bit weird. What really do these people have in common? Why would atheists and adamant extreme jihadists be working together? They seem to not have a whole lot of common in their belief systems. And we've talked about that a little bit on this show. What do they share at a spiritual level? We know that they both oppose the biblical foundations of the Judeo-Christian West. That's certain. But that doesn't fully explain it. And to a lot of us, it also looks like a kind of brand new alliance with a lot of strange things like Queers for Palestine. But Izabella Tabarovsky has done a lot of work investigating this Red-Green Alliance. She is a scholar of Soviet anti-Zionism and contemporary left anti-Semitism. Izabella is also a senior fellow with the Z3 Institute for Jewish Priorities and a senior advisor with the Kennan Institute at the Wilson Center based in Washington, D.C. Izabella Tabarovsky, welcome to Eyes on Israel.
To be here. Thank you for having me.
So, Izabella, I just mentioned this Red-Green Alliance, and again, it looks like something brand new that's birthed out of intersectional progressive ideology, maybe just a simplistic expression of the victim ideology, that here the Palestinians are viewed as the brown people who are victims of the European colonialists. That's the way it's presented. But I've been reading your research, and I've been really chomping at the bit to have you on the show. I've been reading some of what you wrote, and also I had the honor to hear you speak a couple of months ago. And you're someone who's really given a lot of thought about the history behind this alliance between Marxist leftists and the agenda of jihadist anti-Israel activists. So could you lay out some of that background, educate us? I'm sure our viewers are chomping at the bit, as I am, as I just said, to hear what you have to say.
Well, I think we have to start with the fact that most of what we hear today emanating from those quarters, emanating from the progressive woke anti-Israel left, repeats virtually word for word what the Soviet Union used to propagate in the 1960s, 70s, and 80s as part of its anti-Zionist propaganda, which itself was part of its broader propaganda directed at the West. So anti-Western, anti-American propaganda couched in the ideas of anti-imperialism, anti-colonialism, anti-racism, et cetera, It was extremely cynical. It was just using all of these ideas. But this was a huge part of what it did. And this was a huge part of what allowed it to unite very disparate forces. As much as it's very similar to what we see today. This very kind of broad propaganda allowed it to bring together the third world, the non-aligned movement, the global left, the Western left, Marxist left, non-communist new left. So all of them could unite under these very broad statements with the idea, the kind of the underlying Soviet idea was to create an alternative global opinion that would be against the United States, against the West, in support of Soviet foreign policy goals. Of course, the last parts, they kept quiet. They didn't say it out loud, but this was the idea.
So where do the Islamists come in? Because as far as I can tell, Islam is not overtly communist or Marxist. So where does the cooperation, as it were, is it just kind of a convenience that they found some allies in these progressive leftists who also hate the same people they hate? Or is there something more integrated and more actively cooperative between these groups?
Look, I think to a considerable degree, it is a marriage of convenience. But again, we have to look back. There is a lot of history to this. The Soviets began working with Arab regimes already in the 1950s. Egypt, Syria were their greatest client states. They, of course, weren't Islamist in the sense in which we understand this term today. They were certainly the Egyptian regime, the Nasser regime was nationalist, secular regime. But the relationships begin to be established then. The Soviets very much supported Palestinian terrorist organizations. Again, we have to understand that this is part of the Soviet idea of gaining influence in the third world so that they can kind of build forces against their main Cold War opponent. But the anti-Zionist propaganda is also a very important part of it. So the third world is important because at this time, of course, there's a genuine decolonization process going on, right? There's a lot of sort of anti-imperialist rhetoric it actually has meaning as opposed to today. Today is just empty rhetoric, and the Soviets turned it into that. But another aspect of it is the anti-Zionist rhetoric. And where does it come in? The anti-Israel rhetoric. So in 1967, Israel won, of course, in the Six-Day War over Soviet Arab client states. And this point was a real moment of shock for Moscow. They really couldn't understand how is it that such a small country could win over these big, armies that the Soviets financed and trained and equipped. And Soviet intelligence services were always inclined toward conspiracy theory and anti-Semitic conspiracy as well. And they begin to develop this whole conspiracy theory about Zionism. They say, well, Israel couldn't have won on its own. It must have been in cahoots with America. And what is the ideology driving this? Well, it's the ideology of Zionism. Of course, Zionism is something completely different, but they redefine it. They begin to associate it with all of the kind of evils that are out there, right? Secular evils. So classic anti-Semitism compares Jews to the devil, but they are secularists. And so they don't talk about the devil, they talk about the Nazis. So they begin to compare Zionists with the Nazis and with fascists and with apartheid, they compare Israel to apartheid South Africa. And they say that Zionists are racist. So every evil that you can think of, they attach it to Israel and they attach it to Zionism. Every cause that was really important at the time for the left in the West, they begin to attach that cause to the Palestinian cause. So they begin to compare the Palestinian cause to the war in Vietnam and the civil rights in the United States and the anti-apartheid movement, so that to make the associations for people with all of that. And so they begin to internationalize the Palestinian cause. And I think that in that, they gain a lot of credits with the Arab states, who begin then to see some of the Arab states were anti-communist, like the Libyans were Gaddafi. They did not love the communists. But at some point toward the early 80s, they see that the communist bloc is saying all the right things about this crucial cause, right? The Palestinian cause, the anti-Zionist cause. And so they understand that there is a lot here that they can do together. And I think that this is when the contemporary Red-Green Alliance really begins to take off.
Wow. So, Isabella, we only have 2 minutes left, but I can't help but think that with all the geopolitical changes that have happened, now the main communist threat to America isn't the Soviet Union, but it's the Chinese Communist Party. And we see that they have gotten into bed with the Iranians. And of course, there's been all the reports about Chinese weaponry being found in Gaza. Do you think that this is just an extension of those same alliances of America's communist enemies getting in league with Israel's enemies?
I see a lot of the very same patterns. A lot of the people who were in the anti-Israel, anti-imperialist alliance back then, and I use quotation marks because it really is very propagandistic. It's not really, it was very much cynical and insincere, certainly on the part of the USSR. So a lot of the same countries that were in that alliance are again getting into the anti-Western alliance. It's a little bit less the left today is much more mixed. So I don't know if we call it a communist thread. I think it's much more complex. Today's left identifies itself as something else, although there's certainly plenty of people who call themselves communists and socialists among the anti-Israel forces. But whatever the name for this new ideology, it's very anti-Western, it's anti-liberal democracy, it's anti-American, and I think it's very dangerous.
So I think the lesson for Americans who are watching this is that this red-green alliance is not just a kind of recent shallow marriage of convenience, but it's a much longer-term arrangement. And also that those who oppose Israel on the world stage are really only seeing Israel as a proxy for the United States, and it really has to do with their anti-American ideology. Just speak to that for a moment and then tell everyone where they can follow your work.
You just put your finger on it. I think this is what's so important. And I know that a number of people have noticed that the anti-Israel demonstrations that we see, the rallies, the encampments that we see in the United States are very much driven by the anti-Americanism by ideological anti-Americanism. I mean, they burn the American flag, right? They talk about tearing down the United States. I think the anti-Israel cause is the anti-Western cause, and we all need to understand it. And we all need to unite against it because the danger is real. The danger to the West is very, very real. And it very much moves on that momentum that began decades ago. I'm on Twitter, now known as X. My handle is @IsaTabaro. I write for Tablet Magazine and for Fathom Magazine. People can find me online, and there's more to come.
Thank you so much, Isabella. And very shortly, we will be releasing a podcast with Isabella on the Shoulder to Shoulder podcast. We'll be interviewing her for a longer form conversation if you want to learn more about these issues. Isabella, thank you so much for joining Eyes on Israel.
Thank you for having me.